Okay, great. I had such an imposter syndrome moment putting together this talk because I'm outside of academia, but I spent a lot of time at Berkeley still, and I was like, gosh, what do I have to contribute to this conference? But it actually dovetails so well with the other two talks that I'm so happy. I also made super sure that I put those 3 little letters at the end of my name before I put together this talk. So I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about my journey from basically through graduate school. So I'll talk a little bit about my science because I might know some of you in this room through BASIS. Who's familiar with the BASIS program, I guess, first of all? Oh, great. So there's a bunch of you that aren't familiar with it. That's awesome. Okay, wonderful. So I just finished my degree. I filed in August of last year, so I've just recently completed my doctorate. So I'm, kind of freshly out of grad school. So I wanted to give you a little bit of academic history. I'm making all these Beetle references because this has been sort of my life for the last 10 years, where people are like, oh, Beetles, who's your favorite? Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of tell you sort of where I came from and where I am now. So I did my undergraduate, I'm a Florida girl. So I grew up with lots of bugs around me, lots of beetles, and I kind of fell into studying the natural world, I think because they just were around me outside and inside my home in Florida. So I didn't want to go to grad school initially. I didn't know what grad school was. So I should mention I'm also a first-generation college student. So I went to University of Florida, and I had no idea what graduate school was. I had lots of TAs there, but I never thought to ask them what they were doing or what their role was for some reason. So I thought I wanted to be a veterinarian. And so I took a course in entomology, basically to give me a leg up to apply to veterinary school. And I fell in love with entomology. And when I graduated with my BS, I started to do some research actually in labs around UF. And I remember I had a position that I was just dissecting lots of moth genitalia is where I started out. And I remember sitting across from the PI of the lab, and I just looked at him one day and I was like, I know this is a little weird, but I really love doing this. I love dissecting moth genitalia. And he's like, oh, have you considered grad school before? And I'm like, I don't know what that is. What are you talking about? And so he's like, oh, you just apply and you do this for what your living. I'm like, oh, okay, great. So that was kind of my first sort of inkling to graduate studies. So I opted to do a master's first because I had gotten lots of advice from people, and they said, if you're not totally certain a PhD is a really big commitment, you should try out if you enjoy this type of study first by doing a master's. So I went to the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque for a few years. I really liked what I was studying there, which was a little kind of like PhD light of what I ended up studying. And so then I applied for Berkeley and studied beetles here. So these are my beetles. They're a family of teeny, tiny little brown beetles that nobody knows about. They're called Adaridae. I am almost literally the only person in the entire world that studies these. There are over 1,000 species, though. They're really diverse. They're found on every continent except Antarctica, and they have really interesting morphological characters. So this is their ventral belly side, and they have these really interesting patches of setae along the hind legs, and on some of them, in some of the species, they actually have a sexual dimorphism of these setae. So, oh, here, I can use this one on the, this is a Lonus, this genus, and this is a male, so they have this huge expanded patch, and the females actually don't have anything. They have a really tiny, simple leg without any of those setae at all. And so I was really interested in kind of tracing this across the evolutionary history of this group of beetles. The problem is that nobody had basically ever studied these, so there was no phylogenetic tree at all for these beetles. So My research questions are focused on previous classification system, and does that confer with molecular phylogenetic analyses? I wanted to do some molecular analyses. So I also wanted to look at this really interesting dimorphic character system and how that evolves. I was just really fascinated by the difference between dimorphic taxa and like how does that evolve, how many times has that evolved, and also did that dimorphism evolve by the gain of the character in males, or was it that both males and females had these characters and then for some reason the females lost them? So I was really interested in kind of like how that evolved, when it evolved. There are actually fossils of these teeny tiny beetles because they get stuck in sap. Oh, I should mention, I'm going to go back actually. And here, yeah, so this is how I collect my beetles. So if you're not an entomologist, you probably have no idea what I'm doing here. So I should mention, this is called a beat sheet, and you just go ahead and you put this under a tree or a shrub, and then you hit the tree or shrub gently, and the natural inclination of a lot of beetle species is to pretend like they're dead and they just fall, and so you collect them onto a sheet. So that's how I gather these teeny tiny beetles. So before I get into sort of what I'm doing now, I thought because of this, title of the conference, I should talk about like the awesome stuff that I did as a scientist. I got to do lots of really awesome things in, like retrospect. A lot of what I did were museum visitations. So I got to go almost around the world, mostly concentrated in Europe because that's where old dead beetles reside generally. So I had never been outside of the country before, and so it was really awesome to just be able to go to Europe several different times throughout my PhD. It was really nice because I also felt like I was taking ownership of this because I was funding myself. I was writing these tiny grants, a couple $100 here, $1,000 here, and like that was funding me to go on these trips. And I just felt so excited that, like this is what I'm doing with my life. And my parents just like do not understand this at all. Yeah, so I got to go to these like really amazing classic museums. If you are ever in Madrid, go to their natural history museum there. It is one of the most fantastic ones I've ever seen. They have this really amazing like natural curiosity cabinet kind of stuff going on. They have a room just with these amazing tigers. They have these, so I think the Madrid museum isn't as well known as like the London or Paris ones, but it's fantastic. So I got to do that and see these awesome beautiful specimens, but mostly what I was looking at are these. So those tiny little dots that you see on the whiteboards, those are the beetles that I'm looking at. And this is, like, that's one right there. You can't really see it, but that's what I actually spent my days doing, but it was great. So I also, think a lot about, like, what did I actually do in my PhD? And this is what I did. I mean, I was able to find specimens from every major biogeographic region from the world and extract DNA from those specimens and analyze those to have a phylogeny for this entire family of beetles on a higher level. So this is like 5 years of work in this one slide. So like that's awesome. I love that. Another really awesome thing that I got to do as a scientist with my research, so this is me kind of spending a lot of time over at Cal Academy, and they have a scanning electron microscope over there. They let me use a lot. So I sat in a dark room by myself looking at beetles and exploring like just what there was to see on these really tiny beetles. So this is the hind leg of, this is Phytogenus, one of the genera. And so like zooming in, I would find cool things, like sitting in this room by myself, I'm like, oh, that's a spine, that's cool. And then I would like zoom further and further in and find what appear to me to be like little gland pores on the end. And I told you, they have these like setae on the back of their hind legs. So looking across different genera, different species, I kept finding these gland pores across, like kind of different looking, but they're kind of always present. So now it looks like these setae might be used for functionally maybe pheromone distribution for these species. We still don't know, but but it's so cool to be like that person sitting in a room and being like, no one's ever seen this before. This is so amazing, right? So I think this is some of the awesome science that I was able to do. And I mean, a lot of, this is what I did. Like, I'm really proud of this. At the end of the day, I put together a phylogeny for a group that represents over 1,000 species, a large portion of our biodiversity on the planet, and reconstructed the classification based on that. So this is just something that not a lot of people are going to know about, which we've already talked about, or potentially use, but it's there now, and it's part of this greater science knowledge. So this is like, I think it's interesting hearing the previous talks earlier about, when you're doing science and you're unsure about what you're doing and whether or not you should potentially stay in academia. Like, I'm really proud of all of this, but at the end of the day, it wasn't what was getting me up in the morning. And it was actually turning into like, I love doing this, but at the same time it was turning into like, this is a job that I'm doing and not a job that I'm loving. And so I was kind of getting that over and over again in my own personal experience, kind of like, what really motivates me to get up in the morning? I mentioned that I wasn't really on a fellowship or anything when I came here. It was kind of a double-edged sword where I was able to do whatever the heck I wanted to in grad school, but I also didn't have the security of funding. So I had to fund myself in some way. So I did a lot of teaching and discovered that I really love that. And that's what really was getting me up in the morning, was working with undergraduate students, working in the lab, preparing lectures, figuring out how students are learning best and how to present them with these scientific concepts where they would really understand that. And this is from a general entomology class that we just went on lots of field trips, and I worked with these students really on an individual level, and that was really what I think was motivating me a lot initially in graduate school. And I should also mention that, for me at least, with the imposter syndrome, for teaching, I would get this feedback from my undergrads a lot where they were like, oh, what do you want to do? Like, we would have discussions, or like, oh, you're going to, be a professor. What are you going to do? I'm like, I really love teaching. They're like, yeah, you're really good at teaching. So if you generally do get that feedback from people in your circle of like what you are really great at. So I hadn't really worked with little kids though yet. So I basically and I'm going to be honest here, out of necessity for funding, I initially was looking at what was a program through the integrative biology department here and the environmental science department. There was an NSF GK-12 program called Exploring California Biodiversity. And I thought, oh, this is a nice chunk of funding. Children are still kind of scary to me. I haven't really worked with young children before. But the program was that you would do outdoor science education with fifth graders. And so I applied for this, and because of lots of teaching experience that I had at the undergrad level, and I think just because entomology is awesome, they awarded me this fellowship. And so I had this fellowship for 2 years, and I loved it. So I worked with fifth graders in the Truckee area, so in the Sierras. And every single fifth grader in the greater Truckee area came out, and we caught grasshoppers together, and we identified species together, and we analyzed distribution data with those students. And it was one of the best experiences of my life. And I was like, oh, fifth graders are really, really awesome. I really love this. So then when this fellowship ended, then I started to do BASIS and work with even younger kids. So this is what I'm doing now, and I actually have transitioned into being the program manager for this program that I participated in as a graduate student. So for those of you that don't know what BASIS is, which is actually a lot of you, which is great, so it's Bay Area Scientists in Schools, and it's a volunteer science outreach and role model program. So what we do is bring hands-on inquiry-based STEM lessons into K-5 classrooms throughout the East Bay. And we have tons of volunteers on campus. So we have over 500 active volunteers. So a lot of my job is emailing and working with a lot of people on a daily basis. I'm on campus more now than I was as a grad student, especially when I was writing up my dissertation. So what are we trying to do with the program? One, provide diverse science role models. So really breaking down the stereotype of who a scientist is and who can become a scientist. And to also show that scientists are real people. I like how we talked about that earlier, where like we have this idealized vision of who a scientist is, like, you know, Einstein. And it's nice to actually put, you know, realism onto the face of a scientist. So we're informing and inspiring these students. So a lot of what we're doing is supplementing limited hands-on science in K-5 classrooms. So if you think back to when you were in elementary school, most of the classic situation is that you have one teacher who teaches all the subjects. And those teachers oftentimes do not have a scientific background, so they might not be very comfortable, particularly doing hands-on science, which generally the kids get very excited and is more rambunctious. And then they also prioritize other subjects that might be, that are tested. So often math and language arts are the subjects that are tested in school, and so funding is closely tied to that. So a lot of teachers that I work with love science, they want to bring more science in, but they just don't have the bandwidth or time to really do that. So we're also supporting and motivating those teachers in the East Bay, because they're always in the classroom when we're doing these basis lessons. So they're there seeing their kids really excited about these lessons that are going on. So this is always what I talk to my volunteers about. Like, I would like to say, like, this is what we're doing at the program, but why should you do the program? Like, what did I get out of it, and what did you as grad students or postdocs, you know, kind of get out of this program? So I got a lot out of volunteering with Basis. Science communication, I practice and make every single one of my trained volunteers do an elevator pitch for an 8-year-old. So how do they actually talk about their science with an elementary school student? How do they make them simplify their language, actually inspire and excite these kids, say like, oh, that's something cool, I want to do that, right? If you're interested in teaching at all, Basis is awesome, because like the science, the outdoor science education program that I was doing, you do the same lesson over and over and over again. So you have like one lesson for, let's say it's like 3rd grade. I do a 3rd grade adaptation lesson right now. And it's really great because you go into the classroom, you teach this lesson, it's an hour, it's hands-on, and then if things don't go so well in certain aspects of it, you're able to reflect as a teacher and say, oh, I don't think the kids really understood what I was saying in this particular part of it. How can I rework how I'm teaching to really get this concept across to this audience? Which I think if you're interested in teaching and the science of teaching, reflecting on your teaching practice is a really important aspect of that. And something you don't get to do that often as a graduate student, because you often, you know, teach a different class every semester if you're a GSI. And then also just in terms of professional development, I wrote Basis into an NSF dig. I was awarded a dig because of all the like outreach that I did, I think. I mean, I'm also, you know, getting imposter syndrome that my science wasn't very good, and so they rewarded me for my outreach, but that's a different story. And then also just getting to work with people. So our volunteers work in teams, and so you get to actually network and be a part of a community outside of your research lab, which is nice. And the big one for me, which really is great with the last talk, talking about the slog of graduate school, or the slog of research, like this is why I loved going into the classrooms, because kids have infectious enthusiasm, and if you're in a slog, like going into the classroom for an hour and hearing little kids be like, I want to be a scientist, this is so fun, I was like, oh yeah, science is awesome. I'm going to go back to the lab and like work through this problem. It'll be great. So really it helped me get out of that slog. So I wanted to mention a little bit also of like what I actually do in my position, because if you're interested in kind of an alternate academic career path, this is something that I've chosen and I've been really happy with, though I'm, you know, just out of graduate school, so I'm fresh. But I do a lot of teaching and curriculum development. So I go into the classroom probably 2 to 3 times a week to work on lessons, to help new teams feel comfortable in the classroom. I'm also working with lots of graduate students and postdocs who want to develop a new lesson on scientific concepts. So I find it a really interesting challenge to have a scientific idea that you want to present to second graders, and how do you turn that into an exploration for them where you're not just telling them this information and spoon feeding them sort of facts, but to have them do a hands-on thing where they're actually creating that knowledge for themselves. It's an interesting logic problem. A lot of my job also includes volunteer recruitment and training. So I get to work with graduate students from all different STEM departments on campus, which is, I love. I think it's awesome. I get to hear about all these different research projects, all this, because, you know, I studied the phylogenetics of these tiny little, like, 2-millimeter beetles, you know, for like 6 years. So now I get to hear about all of this amazing science, and it's really great because I then get to help these students. They tell me what they're doing, and then I try to help them kind of frame that in a way that a third grader can actually understand. So it's really fun to work with all these amazing individuals. I also do a bit of teacher professional development. So I work with elementary and middle school teachers throughout the Bay Area. And if you see, there are a couple of programs, if you see these advertised and you have the opportunity to work with teachers, I would highly recommend it. Teachers are so amazing to work with, and it's really great because a lot of them love science. They want to know how to talk with their students about this, but they're just not sure, or they're uncomfortable with the subject material, and they're not sure how. So if you ever had the opportunity to work with teachers, yeah, you should definitely try to pursue that. So one thing that I wanted to mention as well with BASIS, and a lot of my job, is ensuring that our lessons are aligned with current science standards, and I wanted to mention kind of what those are right now. So in California, we've adopted what are called the next generation science standards, and so we're moving from a content-based to a practice-based standard. So we're focusing now on what scientists are doing and how they're thinking, and framing science as this sense-making activity, which is so fun to be in this position right now that I'm in, where I work with scientists, and we're trying to actually now frame this in a different way to elementary school students, to really have them take ownership of their own learning and kind of present them with phenomena and say, like, hey, why is that? Let's figure it out. Let's kind of do this hands-on experiment and understand it together, which is exactly what grad school is all about, right? It's not because somebody gave you the answer to this question and you're like doing a canned lab, right? You are here because you love the science and that kind of quest for knowledge of like something that we don't know. And I think for a lot of people, that's sort of like your initial kind of hook into science, is that like, oh, I learned something new today that like we didn't know before. So I just wanted to mention in closing, I had a lot of struggle, especially towards the end of grad school, about what I wanted to do with my life. I still struggle with that. But I was presented this Boulder challenge probably a year or so out from when I actually graduated. And so I recommend that you take this Boulder challenge yourself, basically every 6 months to a year. I think it really helps me. So the challenge is draw where you picture yourself 10 years from today. Write about what you would like to do this year to orient towards your big goals in life. And define a handful, which would be 2 to 3 boulders for the semester. So if you're on a semester schedule. So this would be like kind of the big things, and then you can break that down into smaller tasks, right? So planning. I was presented with this, and I found I had an existential crisis essentially with this. Like with the first step, draw where you picture yourself 10 years from today. I had no idea. I just sat there and I literally like had a nervous a nervous breakdown basically, because I just like, I don't know where I'm going to be in 10 years. I have no concept. I have no clear definition of where I'm going. And so I'm going to show you what I drew. This is all that I drew. That's it. So this is all that I decided that I'm also not an artist, so I'll put that out there. But I first freaked out about this, and now I'm so happy with it. Like, this fills me with such joy, actually, now, that this is what I decided to draw. So I decided that I'm smiling, I want to be happy. Like, that's where I want to be in 10 years. I want to be a happy person. I know that my pathway is going to be very windy, and I was really okay with that, and I expect that. Like, I love my position right now. I don't expect to be in this position forever. I expect to transition to lots of different positions, and I'm excited about that. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of doing a postdoc and then going on like to another postdoc and then not that that's an easy path at all, but it was just one that I was like, I know that's a clear path, and it's not really, I want kind of a crazy path. I want a weird, windy one. I also really want a dog. And I knew that in 10 years, I'm like, I'm gonna have a dog, but I don't wanna put expectations on what that dog's gonna look like. So I put it off screen so that I knew there would be a dog there, but I don't know how big or small it's gonna be. I just know it's gonna exist in my life 10 years down the road. And so that's my long and winding road, you know, from Beetles to science outreach. And I'm really happy with this, because I think when I drew this, I had this like kind of realization that for a really long time, I was letting grad school define who I was instead of me defining what my grad school experience was. And once I made that switch, I became a much happier individual and a much more focused individual on what I needed to accomplish with my science and with my other activities with my science outreach. So thank you guys for listening, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.